Hello all, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our Kendal at Home Coffee Hour series. With this installment focusing around Ernest Hemingway's The Nick Adams Stories with our guest, Dr. Hilary Justice. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Justice. My name is Ryan Anderson. I'm the Outreach Manager for Kendal at Home, and I'll be moderating this event here. And with me from the Kendal at Home side is Sue Woykin, Marketing and Events Coordinator for Kendal at Home. And she'll be monitoring the behind the scenes stuff for us, making sure Zoom's functioning well and monitoring the chat for any questions, comments, technical issues that you may have throughout it. So before I introduce our guest today, just a few housekeeping items here. If you have any questions, comments, concerns throughout the discussion and want to pose questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A. There will be a time at the very end of our segment for Dr. Justice to go over any questions that you may have, and she'd be more than happy to answer those for you. Also, if you don't like the view, if you want to put the presenter off to the side and focus just on the presentation, if you want to have it be a pop-out window, feel free to play around with your view. Up in the top right-hand corner, there's a button where you can select, and it'll bring down a couple different options for you to choose from. And then lastly, we do have closed captioning enabled for this event. So at the very, very bottom, you can see a button called Live Transcript along with the closed captioning logo there. And if you click that, three things will pop up for you. It shows up show or hide subtitles. And then the third one is the other important one, which allows you to change the settings there and make it larger, smaller, based on how you want to view those subtitles there and the closed captioning. So without further ado, Dr. Justice is here. So Dr. Hilary Justice is a Hemingway scholar in residence at the JFK Library and Museum, which is the world's principal research center for Hemingway's works and lives. She's published a book and written many essays on Hemingway's life. And so we are very, very thankful to have you here today to show us the story arc of these Nick Adams stories, to walk through this life. And give us more insight on what we should be looking at, how we should be seeing this, key things that we might not have mentioned, and any other takeaways that you have throughout it. So we're really looking forward to your insight here, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this all week, so I'm excited to get started. I'm going to start off with my screen share, so this can always go a little sideways. So can you confirm that you're seeing screens?
Looks great.
All right, thank you so much. So just a little bit about why the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library has a Hemingway scholar in residence, because that's a little distracting thing that might bug you and pull you away from thinking about Hemingway. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the archives where I work and what we hold in it and who it belonged to. And then I'll be drawing from those archival holdings throughout our discussion today. The Ernest Hemingway collection at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston was the gift of Hemingway's widow, Mary, of Hemingway's own collection of his papers, his personal photographs, which there are more than 11,000 of them, and a few museum objects. So the best way to think about it is it's Ernest Hemingway's Ernest Hemingway collection. This isn't something that we've gone out and purchased piecemeal. It was the outright gift of Hemingway's widow. So the photographs and other things I'll be showing you today, by and large, were Hemingway's own. So let's get started with what the Nick Adams stories are. They're an obvious standalone group of Hemingway's short stories. They share a protagonist, the main character, Nick Adams, who is sometimes thought to be a version of Hemingway's avatar, a fictionalized version of the writer, or more accurately, his memories. Each story does contain some autobiographical elements that, excuse me, that we can pinpoint, but they are crafted fiction. Each story considers an important moment in Nick Adams's life, and these moments range from Nick's childhood through his service in World War I to coming home as a veteran to his adulthood. The Nick Adams stories were first called that in 1972 by the editor Philip Young, who compiled 24 Nick Adams stories, that some of which Hemingway had published, some of which he hadn't. And Professor Young organized them in so that they would appear sequentially in the order of Nick's presumed age in the stories. This is not at all how Hemingway published them, but it does allow you to read the Nick Adams stories as a sort of Bildungsroman, a coming of age story, starting when Nick is very young and ending when he is a grown man with a son of his own. So I've got those listed on the screen, and now I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the work that Professor Young did in organizing them and presenting them to the public. And then we can talk about how Hemingway wrote them, considered them himself, how they come out of values that he learned in his childhood and adolescence, his young adulthood, how those stories fit together as a unit in Hemingway's mind, and how they fit within his larger works. And then my dissertation director's favorite question, so what? We'll get to the so what at the end. So these are the 24 stories that Professor Young identified as Nick Adams stories. Some of these individual stories weren't actually titled by Hemingway, and they actually are bits that hit the cutting room floor when Hemingway was editing. So for instance, Three Shots, that title is given to it by Professor Young, is Hemingway's rejected opening of the story published as Indian Camp. The end of Something in the 3-Day Blow, written a little bit later, those were actually written, titled, and published by Hemingway in that order. They appear right next to each other in his short fiction collection, and they're very much a part one, part two of the same story. Big Two-Hearted River and On Writing is another cutting room floor situation. Hemingway's manuscript for the Big Two-Hearted River is over 170 handwritten pages long. And the section that Professor Young chose to publish as On Writing occurs in the middle of this enormous manuscript. However, On Writing contains a very personal Ernest Hemingway rant. He was writing the Nick Adams story, and then all of a sudden, he was in a section where Nick was remembering something, and then all of a sudden Hemingway was remembering something. And the next thing you know, Hemingway is ranting about Ezra Pound. He's talking about his wife, Hadley, and he eventually pulls it together and it goes back into a Nick Adams story. Hemingway quite rightly lifted that out, said, wait a minute, that's not a Nick Adams story, that's my own stuff. Stuck the two halves of the story together and published them as Big Two-Hearted River. In order to publish On Writing as a Nick Adams story, Professor Young had to change the names. Most notably, he had to change the name Hadley, the name of Hemingway's first wife, to Helen, which was Nick Adams's wife. Now I Lay Me and In Another Country are a little bit later, and these were written similar to the end of Something in the 3-Day Blow. Now I Lay Me's original title in Hemingway's drafts was In Another Country, Part 2. So it's a Part 1, Part 2 story. And for whatever reason, when he published the stories, Hemingway decided to change that, make it less obvious. And they, in fact, are not adjacent in the collection that they appear in, Men Without Women. So these are the stories from the list. You can see it's shorter, that Hemingway actually published during his lifetime. So Professor Young, bless him, did a lot of archival work, chose to share things with the publish that with the audience that Hemingway never chose to publish, that Hemingway deliberately cut, pieces that weren't finished, etc. So that's one of the fun things and the dangers of working in the archives is you're constantly asking yourself these ethical questions. Hemingway didn't choose to share this. What right do I have to do that? A little bit more about the writing of the stories before we talk about Hemingway's life that went into the stories and how the stories fit in his overall works. They were written from 1918 to 1952, give or take. That last date is a little soft. It's very difficult to date Hemingway's later works that are unpublished. The highest concentration of Nick Adams stories in Hemingway's overall output takes place in the 1920s. Almost every Nick Adams story was written in a pair, sometimes with those other Nick Adams stories, like I've already mentioned, but most excitingly, alongside another invisible group of Hemingway stories that scholars tend to call the marriage tales. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but for every Nick Adams story, there is an accompanying marriage tale that was written at the same time. Again, they don't appear adjacent to each other in collection. This is really the work of scholarship that's uncovered this. And finally, 25% of the Nick Adams stories were published posthumously. They were either unfinished, unpolished, or scrapped for some reason. A little bit about Hemingway's life before the first Nick Adams story. The photograph that you're seeing is from our collection. It was taken by Hemingway's father, and Hemingway is about 5 years old in that picture. He's wearing an outdoorsman costume. He seems to be fishing, but we have other pictures taken at the same time that shows he's really pretending. He's holding a stick, but he called that his fishing hat. He's obviously holding his father's fishing creel. And a lot of the Nick Adams stories take place in this setting, the woods of northern Michigan, as Hemingway remembered it. Hemingway was born in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park, Illinois. His father was a doctor. His mother was a profoundly talented musician who had pursued a professional career and then given it up to marry Dr. Hemingway. She did continue to give music lessons in their home. So Dr. and Mrs. Hemingway had 6 children, of which Hemingway was the second oldest. He was born in 1899, and he enjoyed an upper middle class suburban Chicago upbringing. Obviously, his mother was a very cultured woman. She would take him to the opera, to the Art Institute in Chicago. His father, in addition to being a doctor, was an amateur naturalist and loved the outdoors, loved natural science. And he started the first Agassiz Club for the children of Oak Park. And Hemingway and his older sister, Marceline, were both members. The family would summer in northern Michigan. At the time, it was believed that getting children, if you could afford it, out of the city into cleaner air and teaching them all sorts of fantastic Roosevelt era values like woodcraft and self-reliance. The Hemingways were strong supporters of Roosevelt and his ideas. So the family built a summer camp up near Horton Bay in Michigan, and that's where this photograph of Hemingway was taken. He worked in journalism in high school. He was on his student paper. His sister was the editor. He was just a contributor. He also played sport. He played the cello. And his favorite courses were, in addition to journalism, English. His English teacher was a tremendous influence on his life. And there's a quotation, "The dictionary is our Bible." And Hemingway really internalized that philosophy from his schooling. When he graduated from high school, his parents wanted him to go to college, but he wanted to get straight out and start living life. And he became a cub journalist on the newspaper, the Kansas City Star. And very soon after that, World War I was going on, and Hemingway wanted to get over there. He really wanted to be where the action was. The United States wasn't in the war yet, so he signed on to become a Red Cross ambulance driver and was very soon thereafter posted to the Italian front. That Italian front is where Nick Adams was basically born in Hemingway's mind. He borrowed or stole a bicycle to get closer to the front than ambulance drivers were technically allowed to, but he really wanted to get out there. So he took that bicycle, he rode to the front, he popped into a foxhole. He was trying to talk to and communicate with some Italian soldiers. He was not supposed to be there. And that foxhole was shelled. At least one of the soldiers was killed. Hemingway received over 100 shrapnel wounds in his legs only. His torso received absolutely no injury. The Italian soldier who was blocking him from that is the one who died. And so after some time in a field hospital, he went to the Red Cross hospital in Milan, Italy, where his life, which had already changed, was about to change even further. So some photographs from Hemingway's collection. On the left, you can see a Red Cross ambulance in the Dolomites, which is the region of Italy where Hemingway was serving. That middle picture, that glorious smile, belongs to the 18-year-old Ernest Hemingway. He was only 18, absolutely beaming because he was absolutely head over heels in love with his nurse, the young woman on the right. Her name is Agnes von Kurowski. And so there he is, this young kid. He's not even 20 years old. He's still a teenager. And he's in the hospital. And he's in love for the first time in his life. The first Hemingway Nick Adams story was written on American Red Cross Hospital stationery. And it's very young. It's the story of Nick Adams at Hemingway's own age, lying in a hospital, wounded, drinking too much, and threatening suicide. Scholars usually put that with his high school writings, the juvenilia. It's not at all mature, but there it is. That is the first Nick Adams story. And this incidentally does not appear in Philip Young's collection, the Nick Adams stories. It appeared for the first time in 2017 in the latest edition of Hemingway's short fiction, edited by his grandson, Sean Hemingway. The Nick Adams stories were, however, a central part of Hemingway's growth as a writer. And in fact, they seem to function like the water that, if you imagine a potter at a wheel with a lump of clay, and that clay is kind of hard and heavy and dry, and the potter will dip their hand into water to make the clay workable and smooth. And that's sort of the image that I like to use for how the Nick Adams stories functioned for Hemingway as a writer over time. So his growth as a writer, from that young teen you see writing on the left out in a field in Michigan, to that older man sitting by a stream bank in Spain in the 1950s. There was the juvenilia. Then there were some stories that he worked on that were famously lost by his first wife in a train station. And then started his real work as a writer, as a mature writer. He was in his early 20s. He first set himself the task of writing one true sentence, and this is taken from A Movable Feast. And from there, he grew those one true sentences into the flash fiction. They're very, very short paragraphs. They occur in our time. And if you've read a collection of Hemingway short stories, you're reading along, it's all very much prose. You turn a page and there's this little tiny paragraph on its own page with a chapter number. That's the flash fiction that comprises the In Our Time collection. Those grew into larger stories, and the short stories is really where we see Nick Adams for the most part. And eventually those stories would get longer and longer and longer, and then Hemingway would write a novel. And then he would return and he would write some more short stories, sort of like the potter with a new lump of clay, building it up, dipping his hand in the water. And then they'd get longer and longer, and then he'd write his next novel. And that pretty much repeats up until about the 1930s, at which point Hemingway entered a new phase in his career. Leaping ahead to the end, after 1952, he never again published anything. 1952 was the publication of The Old Man and the Sea. But Nick Adams does show up again, even in this late period, in unfinished short stories, and also, I'm going to argue, in one of the novels that was published posthumously. The trajectory of the Nick Adams stories, looking at Nick in order of his age, Nick starts out being Hemingway's very own age. Hemingway is 18 or 19. He doesn't have the perspective to really reflect back on childhood. He's more interested in becoming an adult. He's also not a fully fledged adult with memories of different phases in his life yet. He's really on the cusp of adulthood, but not quite there. From 1923 to 1933, which is where you see the bulk of Hemingway's published Nick Adams stories, they were not written in any chronological order referring to Nick's age. Nick ranges from being a very young boy in Indian camp to being a father with a young boy of his own in Fathers and Sons. The last touchstone for Nick Adams, where he appears at least as a character, is a story that Hemingway drafted but never completed in 1952 called The Last Good Country. And he takes Nick back to the pre-war era, where he's sort of middle teenage years. He's off in the wilderness with his younger sister. Professor Young assigned some categories to the Nick Adams stories, those that take place in the Northern Woods, Nick on his own, Nick in the war, a soldier returning home, and then Nick in the company of two, which is Professor Young's way of talking about marriage and adult romantic relationships. There is an alternative way of thinking about these categories, though, and it centers around the various undiscovered countries that Nick engages with, whatever his age is. So in childhood, he appears in the role of the son, but he's starting to look at his father and realize that there are some differences in how they see the world. That sense of observing adult roles continues more obviously in the stories where Nick is an adolescent. He then moves and assumes an adult role, even though he's very young, as a soldier. He then returns home. He's still only about 20 years old when he becomes a war veteran, which is yet another role. We see Nick as a young husband in the pre-fatherhood years, another role. And then finally, we see him in fully fledged fatherhood, a story in which he is actually mourning the loss of his own father. And each of these roles fit into this undiscovered world of what's next, what are my roles, how am I supposed to be a man, a human being in this very strange world, and not to be forgotten, in this very strange century. Hemingway was born in 1899. Queen Victoria was still on the throne. When he died in 1961, the Beatles were in the recording studio. And so just imagine all the changes that took place globally, politically, culturally, socially during the 20th century. And that was Hemingway's lifetime. And so in a sense, it was also Nick's. I'm going to take a closer look, although because of time, sort of a fast one. This is sort of the Mr. Toad's wild ride through the Nick Adams stories, at a few of these stories, chosen in part because the archival holdings are shareable, they're interesting, or just because I like them. The ones that occur in Professor Young's collection are listed here. But I mentioned that these stories were written in pairs with another group of stories that Hemingway didn't name, scholars named, called the marriage tales. And so for the first closer look, I'm going to show you the stories that these were paired with, and I'm going to add a story that's, I think, is a Nick Adams story, even though the character's name is different. So The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife was written at exactly the same time as Cross Country Snow. These are both Nick Adams stories, and it's the only time that the Nick Adams stories cross over and become a marriage tale in Cross Country Snow. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Taking the end of something in the 3-Day Blow as a single story, they were written back to back. It's sort of like part one, part two. The other story Hemingway was working on there is a story called Cat in the Rain, and it's one of the European stories where a husband and a wife are in Europe and they're having a hard time. Big Two-Hearted River, it doesn't have a paired marriage tale for a reason that I'll get to soon. 10 Indians, in which Nick is a young adolescent. It was written in exactly the same month as the marriage tale Hills Like White Elephants, which is perhaps one of Hemingway's most famous stories. It's certainly anthologized enough, and it's frequently taught in English classes. In Another Country and Now I Lay Me, again, it's a part one, part two story, and it too does not have a marriage tale pair. And then the story that I'm proposing is a story that occurs in a later novel, The Garden of Eden. It was published posthumously, but it's sort of an experimental work in which it's by and large the story of a marriage between the two of the main characters. But the male main character is a writer, and he is writing stories about his own childhood in the wilderness with his father. And we get that story as part of A Garden of Eden. So that story, the elephant story within the Garden of Eden, functions very much like a Nick Adams tale. The writer is a fictional character, not Hemingway, although it gets a little meta. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So first focusing on The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, which was written concurrently with Cross Country Snow. The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife concerns Nick Adams as a very young boy, and his father is facing an ethical problem. There are some logs from the local logging industry up in Michigan that have drifted away from the large floats of log transport on the lake, and they've come to rest on the beach in front of the Adams's summer cottage. And if you're hearing Hemingway's summer cottage, we can identify the setting. As far as we know, the plot of this story is entirely fictional. So Nick's father hires some of the local Native Americans to saw up the logs for him so he can keep them. This is a theft in a way, if you look at it a certain way. And you can see that Dr. Adams struggles with this. And Dr. Adams's wife, meanwhile, is a hypochondriacal Christian Scientist. So she's lying in a dark room with a headache, complaining about the screen door slamming too loudly. And little Nick is observing all of this, but there's no indication that he actually understands the depth of the adult problems that the adult characters are facing. Starts off, he's reading, he's sitting under a tree. He hears his parents have a bit of a spat. He sees his father's face, and then he closes his book and says, "I know where there's black squirrels, Daddy." And he and his father go off in the woods. It's sort of a Huck Finn, like lighting out for the territory. Let's get away from all the crazy problems of the modern world and let's just go hunt this great quest animal, the black squirrel. Cross-country snow also concerns a father, but that father in this story is Nick. His child hasn't been born yet. This is his last European skiing trip before he has to leave Europe, as Hemingway did, return to the States, as Hemingway did, for the birth of his first child. And although the story itself seems to just be about skiing with a friend, Nick is really struggling and troubled by what it means to be an incipient father. I've chosen to illustrate the doctor and the doctor's wife with this photograph from the Hemingway collection, in part because you can see the detrimental effects of the logging industry on the Michigan streams and lake shores where Hemingway spent summers as a child. And I've paired it with a quotation from the story. But mostly I selected it because Hemingway's father took this photograph. And in fact, all of the photographs of Hemingway as a child that you'll see in this presentation were taken by Dr. Hemingway, Clarence Hemingway. His father was an early adopter. He loved tech. So in any case, the logs had been lost from the big log booms that were towed down the lake to the mill by the steamer Magic. If no one came for them, they would be left to waterlog and rot on the beach. And that's a quote from the doctor and the doctor's wife. There's Hemingway with that stick again. It was probably taken the same day. Moving on to The End of Something in the 3-Day Blow and its paired story, Cat in the Rain. These were written in March of 1924. In The End of Something, we see Nick Adams having an unspecified spat with his first girlfriend, Marjorie, based on a real person, Marjorie Bump. As far as we know, she and Hemingway were just friends. They knew each other in Michigan. That relationship ends for no apparent reason. Marjorie's like, "I thought we were having fun." And Nick's like, "Yeah, it's just over." So it's very strange. And then Marjorie very capably takes the boat that they're there in and rows it away. Gotta love Marjorie. She's such a great proto-feminist character. In the paired story, or in its part 2, The 3-Day Blow, we learn a little bit more about why that breakup happened. Nick is hanging out with an older friend of his, Bill, and they're getting drunk. And based on Nick's reaction, where he's like, "Wow, look at my hands. I've never looked at these before." It's probably the first time he's ever been drunk. He's still pretty young. But Bill is saying that it's such a great thing that Nick broke up with Marjorie, because have you looked at Marjorie's mother? She's just awful, and you don't want to end up saddled with that. It's this really cynical older male companion's perspective, and Nick is kind of observing it, and he doesn't seem to quite buy it. One of Hemingway's favorite statements in these early Nick Adams stories is, "Nick said nothing." So Nick is kind of functioning as a journalist, sort of observing this strange world of adulthood, which seems kind of problematic, and maybe I don't want to go there. The paired story, the paired marriage tale that was written at the same time as these two, is Cat in the Rain. And it's definitely a moment in a marriage where you got to wonder why these two people are married. And you also have to wonder if they're wondering. And so the emotional connections of these two stories is pretty obvious. And Cat in the Rain, too, takes on roles of adulthood. The wife in the story is wondering what her role as a wife is, if she was raised to be a wife and mother, but she's living an itinerant life, traveling through European hotels with her husband, who's just lying there reading a book. She's like, I want to have my own table. I want to grow my hair long. I want a cat. What does she actually want? Who knows? Scholars get a little reductive about it and say she wants a baby, but I think that's too simple. I think she's just having one of those dark tea times of the soul, and her husband just doesn't get it. And his worst line is, why don't you just shut up and get something to read? And so in all of these stories, there's an alienation from these presumed roles as defined by perhaps the previous generation, or perhaps just by the human condition. How are we supposed to navigate adulthood, relationships, marriage, romance? It's all very confusing. Jumping ahead a little bit, even farther, to two stories that were written in May of 1927, 10 Indians and Hills Like White Elephants. In 10 Indians, Nick is once again extremely young. He has spent 4th of July with some friends of the family, and he comes home, joins his father at their cabin in Michigan. It's always the cabin in Michigan. And his father is in the position of having to tell him that this young Native American woman that little Nick has a crush on is actually in a relationship with someone else. And the ethical dilemma in this story is, once again, Dr. Adams, just like in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife. He really doesn't want to tell his son. His son's heart breaks, and then he has to figure out what to do about it. It's a heartbreaking tale from Dr. Adams' perspective, but Hemingway, of course, is a modernist, so we get all that from Nick's perspective. It's very interesting. Hills Like White Elephants, once again, concerns incipient fatherhood. There's an unmarried couple. The woman is pregnant. The man is trying to convince her to have an abortion, and she doesn't want to. So going back to 10 Indians, again, photographed by Dr. Clarence Hemingway of his young son, Ernest, in Michigan. This is how we can pinpoint the setting, and we know that Hemingway may actually have been working from these photographs when trying to remember the Michigan of his young childhood. I think a lot of us do that. Our early childhood memories are often just memories of photographs that we've seen. In any case. The next one is my favorite one. In the rejected drafts of 10 Indians, Hemingway fully switches to Dr. Adams' point of view, and he goes and he watches his young son sleeping. That was cut from the published story for narrative purposes, head hopping like that. Faulkner does it all the time, but it's not something Hemingway ever really got into. But this is a photograph of young Ernest sleeping, taken by his father. And this is the end of 10 Indians. He lay for a long time with his face in the pillow, and after a while he forgot to think about prudence, and finally he went to sleep. When he awoke in the night, he heard the wind in the hemlock trees outside the cottage and the waves of the lake coming in on the shore, and he went back to sleep. All right, we're now going to move into the stories that don't have a paired marriage tale, and there's a very particular reason for that. The stories, the first of which is Big Two-Hearted River. And Big Two-Hearted River, as I've mentioned before, is an incredibly long story, especially in manuscript. And what's happening here in Hemingway's growth as a writer, he's finishing up his first published book of short stories, but he's also getting ready to write a novel. And so you start off with a sentence, and then you have those little paragraphs, and then you get short stories, and then suddenly Big Two-Hearted River sort of overflows its banks, becomes almost uncontrollable in the drafts, and he manages to condense it and sort of nails it down, and it becomes the anchor story, or the last story, in his first collection titled In Our Time. In Big Two-Hearted River, Hemingway had enough on his mind. I'm about to be a published writer. Wow, this is cool. Never mind the marriage tales for Big Two-Hearted River. In this story, Nick is a returning veteran, and he, like Hemingway did after getting back to the US after being wounded, he goes off to Michigan and sort of retraces the steps of a pre-war fishing trip that he took with friends. The war is never mentioned in the story, but Nick shows some of the signs of struggling with post-traumatic stress issues. And one of the things he does is he focuses very hard on what he's brought with him, setting up his camp. Only when he's done that does he allow his memory to sort of drift back to these earlier fishing trips with his friends. And the implication is that these friends didn't make it through the war. Here are some photographs from Hemingway's teenage fishing trips with his friends. And so these are Hemingway's memories that sort of in Big Two-Hearted River become Nick's memories. So we see Hemingway at various teenage ages on the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks are huge in the opening of Big Two-Hearted River with his fishing rod in the case, some fish laid out, and cooking takes a very central role in the first part of Big Two-Hearted River. He's remembering how his friend Hopkins made coffee. And apparently there was an argument about how to make coffee over a campfire that they had on that pre-war trip. Well, actually, one of the two gentlemen in the last photograph on the right is Hemingway's own personal friend, Hopkins, and they were all cooking together in Michigan. I can't figure out which one is Hopkins. I've tried. No idea yet. What's missing from Big Two-Hearted River is the other heartbreak that Hemingway was trying to get over when he went back to Michigan to go on a solo fishing trip. And if you remember that pretty nurse that he was in love with, not too long after he got home, she wrote him a Dear John letter ending their engagement. She was a lot older than he was. He was 18, she was 27. And she's just like, kid, still kid to me and always will be. Can you forgive me someday for unwittingly deceiving you? She was in love with him. She knew she shouldn't be. He left and she kind of came to her senses. But that heartbreak is what Hemingway was trying to get over when writing Big Two-Hearted River. Moving along to the next two, In Another Country and Now I Lay Me, we go back to World War I for these. These are the anchor story for his next story collection. So there was In Our Time, then there was The Sun Also Rises. Then there's this collection, Men Without Women, which In Another Country and Now I Lay Me anchor as sort of the end hefty story. The very next novel he's going to write will be A Farewell to Arms, which picks up a lot of these war themes from these Nick Adams stories, a couple of the marriage tales that I've mentioned so far. And this is really the last piece of it. And in these two stories, Hemingway focuses hard on being a soldier, lying awake at night in a foreign country, the details of the things that catch his notice, the fear is palpable, survivor's guilt is palpable. What does it mean to be a soldier? I've been wounded. I'm not a hero. Some of these other wounded soldiers really are. It engages very, very seriously with the personal questions of what it means to be a soldier, to be a wounded soldier, to be in a foreign country fighting a war. The memories that these are based on, again, we can pinpoint a lot of these. These are a couple of images from the archives and then one from the Italian World War I photographics museum of the soldiers in the field station before they go to the hospital. That field station is sort of part of Hemingway's memories in Now I Lay Me, where he's lying awake at night. He's afraid to go to sleep. He remembers being shelled. He falling asleep, equating with nearly dying. He can't do it. And so he runs over his memories of being a young boy and his parents and fishing while he's lying in that field station. And then In Another Country is after he's been moved to the hospital and he's beginning to do rehab work. And so on the left, we have Hemingway's medals from World War I. There were medals that, if you take the story as any indication, were received basically for being an American who was wounded in what at the time was an Italian war. And then the certificate that went with those medals, the language of that certificate actually appears in the story In Another Country, when Nick is reflecting on how empty his medals are because he didn't really do anything. All of these come together, as stories will, into A Farewell to Arms in 1929, which of course is the story of an ambulance driver. He falls in love with a nurse. If you haven't read it, do it. It's a great story. I want to end by talking a little bit about the elephant story from the Garden of Eden that I alluded to, because you can pick up the Nick Adams stories, you can read them, you can imagine what they meant to Hemingway, how they work in Hemingway's, overall output. You don't have to. You can just read them because they're good stories. Maybe you love them, maybe you hate them, and that's all fine. But I'm including this one because if you love Hemingway, don't love Hemingway, like the Nick Adams stories, don't like the Nick Adams stories. This is really the culmination of the work that Nick Adams did for Hemingway as a writer. And it's not really talked about this way, because even if you just do a fast Google search, plot summary, Garden of Eden, who are the characters, you're going to end up with the story of the marriage tale. It's a love triangle. It's really sexy. It's really erotic. It pushes the boundaries. It was not published during Hemingway's lifetime. And that's what most people focus on in this story, just because it's titillating, it's sorrowful, it's beautiful, it's people struggling with gender roles, and it's always roles with Hemingway. What does that mean? But The Garden of Eden as a novel wasn't finished at Hemingway's death, but the elephant story that its protagonist writes was. It is as polished as any Hemingway story ever, and it's beautiful. And you can just read it just for that, and I promise you, you won't be disappointed. So The Garden of Eden was written after World War II. He never finished it. He was working on it up until the year of his death. So it was posthumously edited and published in 1986. And it was excerpted, interestingly, in Life magazine, which took the love triangle part of the story to excerpt, and Sports Illustrated, which took the elephant story, the Nick Adams-like story, to focus on. The main character's name in The Garden of Eden is David Bourne. And going through the manuscripts for the story, what his original name was and how his name evolved is kind of interesting. So I'm going to take a really weird detail side road for a second. David's original name in the manuscript was John. And that's a little strange because Hemingway's sons, his firstborn son's name was John Hadley Nicanor Hemingway. Very, very quickly, we're not even on page 11 of the manuscript, John gets changed to David, because I think Hemingway knew that this story was becoming very sensual, and that would have to be weird. It's like, the father, that's my son's name. No, change it to David. But David in Hebrew means beloved. And Hemingway was really big on names and knowing what names meant what and why he would choose them. David's last name, Bourne or Burn, however you choose to pronounce it, is sort of an archaic English word. It can mean a stream, in part because a stream would offer a limit or a boundary around a field. And that's usually the way the word was used originally. It also came to mean a goal or a destination. And so if you think about all of the various threads that are very subtly present in David's name, there's the sun factor, there's what are the limits of adulthood? The whole novel is about transcending limits, and the elephant story is about discovering them and then what you do with that. So I just include this. This is from the Sports Illustrated cover. And I'll tell you a little bit about the plot of the elephant story. So David in the elephant story is a very young boy. He's in the wilderness. He most strongly associates with his father. He learned about how to exist as a human being in that wilderness from his father. This is all very much like Nick Adams with his father in Michigan, and likewise Hemingway. And so David and his dog, Kibo, are out and about exploring, and they see this just transformative, beautiful, huge elephant by moonlight, and they follow the elephant because they've learned all about tracking and we can do this. And so it's this young boy sort of imitating what he has seen his elders do. And he has just this ethereal, powerful experience. And he follows the elephant to an elephant graveyard. And he watches the bull elephant, which moves the bones of these other elephants around with this tusk. And then the young boy David goes home, back to their camp. And he tells his father and their guide, Juma, about it. And as you might expect, it's a Hemingway story. Juma and his father want to see where he's gone. And Juma realizes that this bull elephant is one he's been tracking for a long time, because the elephant is visiting the bones of his Askari, which means friend. And so David's father and Juma track and kill the bull elephant that gave this young boy such a magical, transformative, ethereal experience by moonlight. And this breaks something in David, specifically how he sees his father. And there's a line, the elephant was his hero, as his father had been. And so it's this moment where the boy breaks away from the role embodied by his father. He is betrayed by it. He refuses to go that direction as an adult. And this is where that story ends. And this is the last sort of completed story that we have from Hemingway, even though it's embedded in a larger incomplete novel. It's all an interesting statement, and I couldn't stop thinking about David's last name, Byrne, because the most famous use of that one word in its original sense in the English language is something that Hemingway would know from his studies in high school with Mr. Platt. It comes from Hamlet, and it's the to be or not to be speech, which of course is the speech in which Hamlet considers suicide. And if you go back to the first Nick Adams story, the juvenile one that Hemingway wrote in the Red Cross Hospital, in which Nick Adams is considering suicide, it sort of brings us in full circle. And Hamlet, of course, doesn't choose suicide, in part because who would Fartles bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no travelers return, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So what, as my dissertation director would say. If you look collectively at how the Nick Adams stories function within Hemingway's overall output, he's asking lifelong questions, both very detailed and very abstract. And it's not just death that is the undiscovered country, but because Nick is a young boy and is growing and always observing, life is also an undiscovered country. And both are true, and both to Hemingway were extremely important. That's what I have for you. So let's see what we have for questions.
Dr. Justice, thank you so much for that, especially that last bit right there. I'm not going to lie, it actually got kind of chills as you brought it full circle and showed and landed us on that. I was like, oh my gosh, like to see how you can pull the name Byrne and equate it back to the Hamlet. And as you said, Hamlet, Shakespeare are going to be very well known to writers of the time, and to pull that all together to be like, well, maybe he was still experiencing those issues and those contemplations of life that he was experiencing as a kid. I think one part that really stuck out to me too was the emphasis on the line, Nick said nothing.
Yeah.
And to look at everything, and I think we all kind of go through life a little bit like that. We're always observing. We're always looking to see what else other people are doing. And I thought, as I grew up, I thought that was what kids did. They looked up to their parents. They looked up to their role models. And as I've grown and experienced life, it's still going on. And as I've talked to people who are a lot older than I am, and they're like, no, we're still doing that too. We're still trying to figure out life as we go along. So it's interesting to hear that perspective on how these stories all mesh together on it. Couple questions that kind of got brought up. Someone mentioned the exclusion of Soldiers Home and Up in Michigan in the Nick Adams stories. Mm-hmm. Do you have any insight as to why those might have been excluded purposefully or not, and why that might be the case?
Sure. There's a fast answer, and it's true, but it's not terribly satisfying. So I'll give you the fast answer first, is that the main characters of those stories are not Nick Adams. They're given other names. In Soldier's Home, the young man's name is Krebs. And although it fits thematically, Hemingway didn't name that character Nick. And so, at least from Professor Young's perspective, it wouldn't count as a Nick Adams story. Up in Michigan, the main character is female. Her name is Liz Coates. And although, again, it's very tempting to, well, Hemingway was a whole person, and he was interested in what he was interested in. And so a lot of these stories do seem to fit together because they're written at similar times. He's thinking about similar things, and he's exploring the American Midwest, what it means to be a good Midwestern boy who goes to Europe and then goes home. How do you see your home differently, as happens in Soldier's Home? Up in Michigan is an interesting one. It's one of the few Hemingway stories written from the woman's point of view. So although I think they definitely fit within the same framework as the Nick Adams stories, they're adjacent to it. They're not disconnected from it, but they're not Nick Adams stories. Again, back to that fast answer, the main characters have been given other names by Hemingway.
If you're going to look through a collection of stories through one particular lens, it kind of disrupts it to add in a whole nother perspective for even just one or two stories. As we continue that.
But it's always worth thinking about Hemingway stories together. You know, the fact that Garden of Eden reminds me of the Nick Adams stories, it might remind somebody else of an earlier story called The Sea Change, which has nothing to do with Nick Adams at all. All of that is valid. So it's whatever resonates for you is the best way to work with them.
Yeah. So another question that came up was, as you looked over the timeline on it, he wrote the first Nick Adams story when he was really young at 18, took a couple years off, came back to it, wrote it over another, I think you had 10 years period of time, then maybe there's some more after that. Obviously a lot of contemplation stuff in there. What kept bringing Hemingway back to these Nick Adams stories to it? Why the gap in years? Why the long duration for these collection of short stories?
Well, that first gap is best explainable because he did move back to the States. He had to figure out what he wanted to be when he grew up. He had to sort of integrate, to the extent that he was able to, his war wounds, his heartbreak. He had to find a job. His parents were really not happy with him because for a while they were just like, "You're freeloading, come on." They weren't wrong, but he had a lot that was going on. And he always knew he wanted to be a writer. So he got some journalism gigs. He met another young woman, fell in love, got married, and they moved off to Paris because that's where the great art was happening. And post-war Paris, the exchange rate was really good. They were poor as church mice, but they could live very simply, read A Movable Feast, find out about their Paris years. So he was always working on his fiction. But as I mentioned very briefly, his wife collected it all. He was off on assignment for the Toronto Star at that point, the paper he was working for. And she was back in Paris. And he cabled her and he said, "Why don't we meet in Switzerland to go skiing?" It sounds like a really ritzy lifestyle. It really wasn't. I mean, Europe's economy was a disaster. And these were Americans. So the buying power of the dollar was higher. And so she thought it would be a great surprise for her to pack all his existent work together and bring it so that he could work on it in the evening after they went skiing. That suitcase that they were in was stolen from her in the train station, leaving Paris. And it's not because Hemingway was famous. The thief probably thought he was getting money or jewelry or something really cool instead of papers he probably couldn't read, right? Because they're in English.
You see a big suitcase in a train station, you're going to take it.
Yeah, whatever. And so all of Hemingway's work between that very early Nick Adams story and then the ones that he then published were missing. So there's a big chunk of that just missing work. So he kind of retaught himself to write after that. I mean, he's had a few traumas for a young man at this point. He's been wounded. His first love affair ended badly. That one's pretty usual. He's lost all of his creative work to date. And so now he has to learn how to write again. So he starts with one sentence and it builds and it builds and it builds. So the 1920s for him as a writer were really learning how to do this. And of course, he's in the best informal university in the world. He's got F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce. You know, modernist Paris was the place to be. And so it was kind of his college graduate work in writing. And then A Farewell to Arms was really his first major statement on all of that trauma. After that, his interest diverted a little bit. He'd fallen in love with bullfighting. He wanted to write some nonfiction work. He was very, very famous very quickly. The stock market crashed. His father committed suicide. He left and moved back to the United States, and suddenly he's surrounded by people who know him as a famous person. And he's like, "I want my privacy." It was really freaky. He had 2 little boys. Very soon after, there was a third. He's trying to protect his kids from media attention, but he loved the media attention. His attention shifted, as it does. especially if you achieve tremendous critical success very quickly and then publish a nonfiction book on bullfighting and all the critics say, that's it, you're done. So he had a lot on his mind. But he would always go back to it, I think, because it was so fertile for him. And it's always go back to the beginning. How did this used to work? Try it again. I mean, I don't think Hemingway was a Freudian, but there's kind of no accident that there's that famous Freudian question, tell me about your childhood, because that's where you can find a vital spark. And I think he always went back to work with it.
That's actually the Freudian psychology is actually a great segue into this next question.
Uh-oh.
So, and it's a comment, and we're looking for your perspective on it, if it's true or not, which it sounds like it's heading that way. But the comment was the presentation seemed as though Hemingway was kind of trapped and stuck throughout his childhood years and his life and experiences there, relationship with the father, etc. Is that true? Is that just how these works were presented today? Is that just one interpretation of that? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I can see how today's presentation would give someone that impression. And in part, it's a little bit because of the chosen topic, the Nick Adams stories. They're all in some ways about the relationship between fathers and sons. Fathers and the sons you might have, the son you do have, the father who is now dead. That's a huge and important part of, I think, anyone's identity, definitely Hemingway's. It's not all he was concerned about, but it is definitely the focus of this particular group of stories. He was equally passionate about international relations. For Whom the Bell Tolls is a story of, an American who's over there fighting with the Spanish rebels. And nothing to do with fatherhood at all. It's a great story. It doesn't fit this particular topic. So I think dealing with Hemingway is a little bit about like six blind men hanging onto an elephant. It's a rope, it's a wall, it's a tree trunk. It depends on which part you've got that you want to focus on. That tends to color how you see the rest of it. He's a big topic. He lived a large life, and his output was very subtle, and its connections are only just now starting to be explored. So if today has felt a little bit reductive, all I can say is guilty as charged, but fitting any Hemingway facet into an hour is a trick and a half.
No, absolutely. And you did a fantastic job in doing it. And it was great insight seeing the whole way on it, how the stories build upon one another, how you see this character arc forming. And as you said, with the relation to childhood experiences, father relationships, other adult relationships there, it could have just been in through this one lens. If it's a story of international relations, you're probably taking a different lens. But as you commented on, it's all about his observations and the way that he's growing and learning about the world. And usually then it's more of an introspective thing and kind of goes back to those childhood experiences, those early stages where a lot of formation happens. I'm not seeing any further questions. If someone has a question, please feel free, as I asked this last one here. But in your opinion, obviously Hemingway is Hemingway. But what about the Nick Adams stories in particular has allowed them to kind of stand the test of time, to have them where we're reading them now, over 100 years since he wrote the first one during World War I. So what about them are making them still discussed today?
One of the things that has always struck me about Hemingway's writing is it is, on the surface level, very straightforward. The language that he uses is extremely accessible, so much so that in English language acquisition classes, Hemingway is some of the first literature in English that students read. Probably the most popularly taught work globally is The Old Man and the Sea. Simply because Hemingway's sentence structure is not florid, it is not Baroque. You can get from one end of a Hemingway sentence, Nick said nothing, to the other, and you know the words, you know what they mean. However, Hemingway demands as much of his readers as Shakespeare does, or as Faulkner does. I think his insight comes from his journalism. You're going to present the facts, but a lot of the writing, the narrative, the crafting of the story will happen in the reader's mind. And so how does a writer do that? And if a writer can capture your imagination, I don't care if they're 100 years old or 600 years old, readers love that. It's a little bit addictive. You become a creative participant in the experience of that narrative. And Hemingway was really good at that. A lot of people don't like Hemingway's style. A lot of people don't like Hemingway's subject matter. And a lot of people don't like what they know about Hemingway.
Mhm.
But when you're focusing on the words, you just sort of take the word Hemingway off of it and look at any of the stories, you do find yourself participating in the construction of it. Concentrating as hard as if you're reading Shakespeare, or your brain is working as hard as if you're trying to read Ulysses. Hemingway is giving you an easier time of it, really. You don't have iambic pentameter. You don't have a sentence that lasts for 50 pages.
Yeah.
But he's got this sort of charm. It's sort of seductive. And he was very much like that as a person. You know, remember that picture of that 18-year-old boy with that great smile in that hospital bed? He was a very charismatic person, and some of that charisma filters into his writing.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that. I look at Hemingway's work on it. I've always liked the fact that it's short sentences. That's very different and unique compared to a lot of other, as you talked about, like the iambic pentameter, the long, lengthy, page-long sentences. It's simple, but at the same time, it still casts that same elegance to it. You can write simple sentences, but to be able to go and paint the pictures that he is with those short sentences, it's an art form like none other. And goes back to what we talked about even before, people logged on, of you being able to look at a painting and how one person sees it's going to be different than the other person, etc. So we thank you very much for your time and on helping us to understand the Nick Adams stories and Hemingway from an expert's point of view, to help us see in depth a little bit more to different things that and enlighten us to things that we might not have seen before on that. Dr. Justice, thank you so much for your time today. For everyone on today, thank you so much for joining us. This has been recorded and will be up on our Kendal at Home YouTube page probably early next week, probably Monday or Tuesday. So please feel free to take the recording, send it out to any friends, family members that might not have been able to attend that you think would enjoy this. That's what we have today. So Dr. Justice, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.